Hi everybody, Tim here with today's episode of Star Trek Voyager, Season 3, Episode 2, Flashback. So, this episode came out in 1996, which is the 30th anniversary for the original series. And Voyager and Deep Space Nine both did their own little, tribute episodes. For Deep Space Nine, they did Trials and Tribulations, which is it's in my top 10 favorite of the Star Trek franchise. This episode had the potential, but to me, it just missed the mark. I think they had a really great idea, and you can kind of tell sometimes when you, look at a book or a movie or something, you can figure out that one moment where the writer decided, hey, this is my idea, and they kind of write around it. How did it get to this point? Where did this point lead? And stuff like that. It all kind of boils down to one point, one instance. And so for this one, you could kind of tell, okay, what should we do? Well, we've already mentioned that Tuvok has been married for, I think it was 67 years or something. So Tuvok is probably at least 100 years old. And so you could kind of see the writers, okay, so if he's over about 100 years old, he may have been alive during the original series, or at least part of the movies and stuff. And so the 6th movie came out, I think 4 years prior to this, something like that. So I'm sure they started doing the math and hey, why don't we just take Tuvok and put him in to the undiscovered country somewhere? And of course, that kind of boiled down to, well, who do we have? What can we do? And that alone is a great idea. It's a great premise. And this episode had that potential. Just the overall plot didn't do it for me. It's very plot driven, and I would rather it have been more character driven, where the whole thing that starts this episode is Tuvok having a vision of him as a child dropping a little girl off a cliff by accident. She's saying to help me, and he can't do it, and she falls off the cliff and dies. And as this keeps happening, Tuvok is he's getting a little funky. He's having a panic attack. He starts talking about Klingon ships and all sorts of other stuff. And so they decided to do a mind meld with Janeway, because that's the closest thing to a family member. And that's where the episode kind of gets interesting, is Janeway and Tuvok are in his mind, in his memories, little inception going on. And they are on board the Excelsior. And it turns out that Tuvok was an ensign serving under Captain Sulu. And it's great to see George Takei as Captain Sulu and all sorts of stuff. Supposedly, this was actually going to be a backdoor pilot with all about Sulu and Rand being on the Excelsior, which I would have watched the shit out of that. That would have been a fantastic show. For whatever reason, they decided not to go with that, and they went with Enterprise instead. Okay, fine, whatever. It's too late now. It's been 30 years. But yeah, a Captain Sulu show, 100% behind that. So, let's see, we have Ensign Tuvok, and there's some really great dialogue in there, especially with Rand, because Rand, to my opinion, was an underrated character. If you guys watched my original series reviews, I always talk about her and how Whitney always kind of felt underappreciated and actually kind of attacked on the set and stuff, and that's why she left the show under very bad circumstances. And then she did kind of make appearances in some of the movies and even in some of the fan films. And so it was kind of nice that she finally felt included enough to come back for this episode. And she has some great dialogue where she's like, it took me 3 years to get out of being an ensign. And so now she's a commander in the episode. And then there's the great scene where Tuvok's making tea for Captain Sulu, and Rand's like, oh, that's going to get you promoted. And Janeway's like, you never brought me tea. And so there's just stuff like that. There's also some fun scenes with Sulu talking to Tuvok where he's like, don't tell me Vulcans don't have a sense of humor, because I know better. And it's just kind of fun. Tuvok mentions how he's 29 years old at this point, which again, if this episode took place 80 years ago and he's about 30, he's going to be roughly about 110 in Voyager. And he mentions how he had such a difficult time on the Excelsior and being under Captain Sulu's command, just the illogic of human beings, that he left Starfleet for over 50 years. Which I brought that up in one of my earlier Voyager episodes, how, like, if he's 100 years old, why is he only a lieutenant in Starfleet? And this episode answered that question. He is a lieutenant because he hasn't been in Starfleet that long. He was in it for a little bit, he left, and then he came back, and then he taught for a while, and now he's on a starship, and now he's the lieutenant. So it kind of actually makes sense, which I don't know how much of that they had planned out and how much they just kind of retconned it as they went, made it up. But anyways, so a lot of this, they bring up a lot of the undiscovered country with McCoy and Kirk being put on trial and how Sulu wants to go save them. And it's actually a really good episode in those moments. Kang makes an appearance, played by the amazing Michael and Sarah, who I always give shout-outs because he's the voice of Mr. Freeze from the Batman the Animated Series. So he played Kang in the original series, he played Kang in one episode of Deep Space Nine, and now he's played Kang in Voyager. Which, okay, I can get the makeup from the original series to Deep Space Nine, but this would have been, now his makeup has changed from the original series to the 6th movie, The Undiscovered Country. That I kind of wanted some, like, an explanation, so that I'm a little disappointed in. But, and it was such a short scene that I really wanted more. And again, like, if Captain Sulu had had his own show, to see some of those old actors and some of those old characters return would have been great. And then overall, so like I said, this part of the episode is really interesting. I was really behind it, especially when, like, Tuvok's brain kind of starts breaking down even more. And, like, Sulu can now see Janeway, and Rand sees Janeway, and just, like, that's all super fun, and I loved that. It's not until we finally get to the end, and you can almost pinpoint the exact moment where the writers are like, shit, how do we end this? Like, why? And it turns out that all of it is just a virus. Like, the Doctor thought it was a repressed memory, and Tuvok was doing all of this to kind of figure out, oh, how did I have this memory when it's never happened? And it turns out that somebody else had this virus and passed it along to Tuvok just before he dies. And this whole thing is just like this little virus that hides in the peptides and travels from person to person. And it's been doing it for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And it briefly even goes to Janeway. So you see, like, young Janeway drop this girl off a cliff. And it's just this virus that, like, implants itself as a false repressed memory in your brain, and it comes out from time to time. And the Doctor figures out a way using radiation, kills it, everybody's fine. That is the worst ending ever. Like, I was so into this episode with Captain Sulu and Commander Rand and Voyager, and everything is amazing. And, like, how are these connecting? Oh, it's a virus that's a repressed memory. I'm sorry, you guys were doing so good, and then just poof, missed the mark. Just went out in left field. For those who have seen this one, what did you guys think about seeing George Takei come back? What did you think about seeing Commander Rand? What did you think about the Excelsior? And what did you think about, like, it's been 30 years since the original series, which at this point it's actually been like 50 years. But when this episode came out, what did you think? How would you compare this to the Deep Space Nine Trouble with Tribbles episode? Go ahead, let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys for subscribing. It means so much to me. Thank you, and I will see you guys next time for The Shoot.